So in all forms of self-development, whether on a technical level as an artist or as a spiritual practitioner, this idea of fear inevitably is something we have to address. Performance anxiety or fear of vulnerability with one's, dancing or singing. Even in Alexander's comes up all the time on the physical level, like fear that the chair is actually there so I can let go of this tension elsewhere in my system. Or from a spiritual perspective, fear of if I let go of this purview on life or this reaction or some other organizing principle, that I won't be as competent as I was before, as successful, or fill in the blank. And so there's all of these, very hyper-specific fears in life, like I'm afraid of snakes. And then there's these very abstract fears of, fear of failure, fear of intimacy or commitment or whatever. And then there's also, the kind of melding of those two things in the everyday moments of our life. And as I was reflecting on many things in recent days, weeks, months, somewhat out of the blue, recalled something that brought up intense fear in me, which should have been such a beautiful thing and ultimately was. But it was when I was an undergrad, I took this autobiography course, and it was a super small seminar with like a very established, esteemed nonfiction writer, won multiple Pulitzers and this and that. And he could be, super, not harsh, and not cynical, but direct in a way where it wasn't always helpful, even though you do appreciate the honesty and the level of rigorous insight that he could provide. But the course was interesting because each week's assignment had to be somewhat in the style or inspired by or working towards certain technical ideas expressed in different forms of autobiography. So the one that I ended up developing fully and writing, a full 200-page piece on was inspired by the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is really the autobiography of Gertrude Stein, but she was writing about herself through her relationship with her partner. And I decided to write about myself via the relationship with my father, my adoptive father. It allowed me to explore so many different aspects of myself, creatively, developmentally, not just our dynamics, but the relationship was a container and mirror for anything else that could come up. And I continued to work on it and workshop with it, not only with the professor, but other writing mentors in my life for about a year after the course. And I thought, I don't know when I'll be ready to maybe push this out in any more serious, full way. I had graduated, I was starting graduate school, I was focused more on musical things, but I was like, this would, what can I get my father at this point in his life? This would be such a beautiful Father's Day gift. So I had it all printed nicely and collated, and I could not bring myself to give it to him. I just had so much anxiety about it. Now, on one hand, when I was very young, my father he never ever did my assignments, but every once in a while he would love to pick up an essay that I was about to turn in, and he could, he was editor of the Law Review. He could be kind of, like my professor, very loving, but to a 10-year-old, very, very critical. He didn't pull any punches, how do you not understand? This is about the structure of it or this or that. And so he was, whether I wanted him to be or not, an early editor. I always got excellent grades in English and composition and their like, and so it wasn't something where he really saw my writing or looked after it, through middle school or high school. He would just, hear about how things were, from other people, how it was received, but he hadn't really looked at a piece of my writing in so long. So maybe some of that fear was a little bit around, the person who had shaped some of my thinking about writing. One of the things he used to always say to me was that you should write how you speak, but just a little bit better, because speech is second draft and you have the reflection of a little bit of time to, make it more nuanced or polished, but it should ultimately sound like you, which I think sounds so obvious, but, regardless of whether you have a very flowery way of expressing or very, more Hemingway, a direct percussive style, of course that should be true, because like everything, you write what you know, but you also write as you speak, because that's just an authentic reflection of your own, feeling and thought channeled into the written word. But I think the real fear was around some of the things I revealed in the text about myself, or my feelings about how my relationship with my father colored how I thought about romantic love or this or that it would somehow change how he saw me. Even though I was 22, I still wanted to be the little girl whom he so adored, or that had this very, loving relationship with. And so his, Father's Day passed. I gave him a card, but I didn't give him this. And then his birthday is in late July, and I happened to be home visiting, so I was getting some stuff ready for a move. And I just was like, I gotta give it to him. But it was like crippling fear. It was the day that I was leaving later, and he was halfway out the door on his way to work. And I just ran up and was like, gave it to him in the most rushed, awkward, ridiculous manner. I was like, this is this thing I wrote, and like ran away, like literally ran away. And then I wasn't home when he got home. I had left for wherever. And, he clearly took some time to read it. And I think later that week wrote me a handwritten note, as my father often did, and said, how I had surpassed him as a writer, and he was so proud of it and he loved it. And look, whatever he said, it wasn't about what he said, but it clearly, didn't change. It only enhanced whatever it is that we share. And, and the irony is I am not the flesh of his flesh. I'm not the blood of his blood. I'm yet still miraculously and somewhat annoyingly his daughter in all of the ways that are adorable and annoying and frustrating and true all at the same time, right? And so to go back to this idea I reference a lot, which comes from Tom, is that there is no coincidence but only coincidence, and that I chose them as my parents on a deep spiritual level as much as I chose the biological ones from whom my genetics come. Fear is always such a chance to, you can shirk away from it or you can capitulate to it. And I think there are still other relationships in my life where I fear, oh, what if they see me this way? I know that when I met my birth mother, I told the closest friends in my life the last. It was easier to discuss that with acquaintances than it was with the people whom I was the closest with. And why was that? Because I somehow had this bizarre, ridiculous fear that it would change how they saw me if this new piece of information was somehow a part of the equation. And it doesn't always have to make logical sense. That's just the truth of the matter. And there are relationships in my life, both deep and new, or this or that, professional or otherwise, where I still come up against a fear of, and I like to think that I'm pretty unabashed and I'm pretty free in myself, but there are always more ways that we can live out loud in Technicolor even more fully. So for what it's worth, where are you hiding from yourself?